I'm Wynton Marsalis, and I'm a musician. Another important thing about Leonard Bernstein and his legacy is that he was always trying to ride the wave of the friction that exists in our segregation. And that segregation is a part of the identity of the world. Of course, the world is tribal, and tribalism has gotten one of its greatest tests in the United States, because we pride ourselves as the melting pot, which of course we are not, but we try to be that. And he's one of the seminal figures in the riding that wave and bridging that gap, in his person and what he represented and what he would say, and in his music. And it comes in many forms. Like we don't realize at this time how large the gulf was between classical music and American popular music, between the Broadway show and an opera, and the type of snobbery involved. George Gershwin was a victim of it with Porgy and Bess, which he was destined to get terrible reviews for that, just because it tried to bring these things together. Mr. Bernstein came later, and what he did in terms of even the success of On the Town and of West Side Story and of his mass, of his symphonies, of his conducting in the New York Philharmonic, programs he would do explaining what jazz was with Miles Davis or with Louis Armstrong, live shows, the breadth of people that he brought together with his music on real terms, meaning that every time these people came together or forms came together, they were not forced to sacrifice their strength or their integrity in order to integrate. In our country, many times, integration for us is, let me get you to come here and be like me so now we can be integrated. That was not his thought of integration. His thought was, let's bring you here and you can be with me and we will be integrated in a way that we can come together and we each retain a power and a significance, and we figure out how to really have a symbiotic relationship. We really see it in his music, which is the thing that he had most control over. And I think that he's viewed as that all over the country. All types of people loved him. People who loved jazz loved him and knew who he was. People who were part of the American band culture loved him and played. How many band versions you have of West Side Story could you play? People of the older generation loved him. Younger people who were exposed to his education. His education was also very integrative, and it was written in a way that brought you together and into the world in a very high-minded American way. He was trying to break down a lot of walls and barriers, and he succeeded in doing that in his work. Is something in our identity. Then when we deal with the whole fact of him being Jewish, I'll never forget that I grew up in the South, and I lived in little towns like Brobridge, Opelousas, Little Farms, and we were segregated black and white. And you didn't really know any white people. You didn't see them. My parents grew up in absolute segregation. And I was born in '61, so kind of the civil rights movement was just getting started. But of course, the effects of it still have yet to be felt, but they certainly were not felt in the 1960s. And I can remember when Martin Luther King got killed, I was integrated into a white school, which meant it was like 4 or 5 black kids, put in all white environments, very negative environment, people messing with you all the time. And I remember the first time I heard it was mainly Italian kids, but we didn't know there was a differentiation between Italians or Jews, or we didn't know, we just knew black and white. There was a Jewish kid that everybody was picking on, but called him some kind of name. So I asked him, man, why do they call you a guy named Reuben? Why are these people? He says, because I'm Jewish. I said, really? I said, is that like in the Bible, or what is that? He said, yeah, kind of. I said, well, what does that name? He said, oh, they mess with me because I'm Jewish. I said, so it's different kinds of white people? He was like, yeah. And why do they dislike y'all? Is it religion? He said, well, my family doesn't really practice the religion, but you have to dislike people for some reason, and that's why they dislike us. And that was the first time I actually thought about the type of anti-Jewish kind of prejudice that existed in America. But at that time, I wasn't at the age to really know about the legacy of World War II and all the various things that later I was learning about. But it always made me keep my eye out, my ear out for the different connections that we've had throughout time, black people and Jewish people. A lot of those connections were burned in the 1960s. because of the Black Muslim movement and all the other different things that happened. But if you think about American music and you go from the Civil War into the turn of the century, all the early immigrants, Irving Berlin, and of course most famously Gershwin, but we could list many people, the whole American song tradition and the involvement of Jewish composers in that tradition. You get a sense of Bernstein's significance and place in that tradition, and also in another tradition, which is the tradition of scholarship that comes from a Talmudic tradition of writing, and of the other connection that I find with him is the connection between the kind of Jewish plain song chant style and the Negro spiritual, which is closely related, not just in substance. And if you take the spiritual, the tradition of the spirituals is almost all the Old Testament sensibility filtered through a New Testament desire for freedom through the Messiah. So when you take the Negro spiritual, you got Abraham and Isaac and everybody sitting right next to Jesus and Matthew and Mark, and it's not so much a separation of the testaments. And of course, the central figure in the spirituals is Moses. So in him, I found also that, and I think that his music, his presence, his intellectual dynamism, his understanding of the country and what the country needed to do to be a better version of itself, and his willingness to step out into that breach and expend his youthfulness and his energy and his vigor to create that world that he thought we should work toward, made him a very singular figure in the history of American music.